大家好，我是温铁军。我们现在开始介绍迈克尔·哈德森教授他的第二节。这个第二节呢，讲的是古代东西方文明关于地租归属的不同政治观念。这其实讲的是这个所谓从传统社会向近代社会演变过程中，那个不同的政治制度对于地租到底是用什么样的方式来获取？需要提示一下的是，他这儿所说的东方和当年马克思在讲欧洲人东西方观念的时候所提示大家的那个观点是一致的。就马克思说呢，说他的这个思想特别是关于历史唯物主义的思想，主要来自于摩尔根的古代社会和这个达尔文的物种起源。那说呢，他说他的这个思想来源，这两个人他们的足迹呢，从未超越地中海。也就是说，在这个摩尔根那儿，在达尔文那儿，他们的这个研究范围呢，主要是地中海沿岸的这些地方。于是乎呢，他们的东方呢，主要就是中近东这个东方，恐怕连印度以远都很难达得到，因为那个时候人的这个能力是有限的嘛。所以这里边呢，这个就迈克尔·哈德森教授，他只是个美国学者了。那他的研究所涉猎到的这些经典呢，这些著作呢，恐怕也是西方人在他们原有的研究范围内所形成的。因此呢，他这个地租问题以及与地租相关的政治制度问题的这个讨论呢，主要还是西方中心这样一个范围吧。当然我不愿意用西方中心主义这样的意识形态的概念来概括他的研究，但是呢，我们毕竟需要注意那个在遥远的东方，在西方人特别是早期的西方学者足迹难以达到的东方，主要是中国这种政治文化在形成影响。而中国它的所谓这个天下观，也就是普天之下莫非王土，率土之滨莫非王臣，它长期以来的政治制度，对于这个土地的这个收益，特别是地租收益，它的这个制度呢，是历史上有相当大的延续性的。它不是像西方这样，因为西方这个客观上有一个很大的不同，就是它自西罗马以后，也就再没有能够有这个完整意义的大型国家了。那它自西罗马公元4世纪灭亡，那除了东罗马还是一个相对比较完整的国家，但更多的就东罗马的统治，更多的呢是在这个东南欧，也在这个西亚，那和欧洲的主要部分这个相对而言呢就相去甚远。而欧洲的这个主要部分呢，就分裂成无数的大大小小的邦国，那成千上万的这样的小地方，那它当然就不具有形成这个中央集权的政治制度的可能。所以呢，那就是说王权与贵族之间的斗争，其实就相当于一个小邦，那这个小邦小的甚至连中国一个县都不够大，那它就其实是一种长期存在的地方斗争。或者是一个相对狭小范围内的不同势力之间的斗争。那用这样的经验来解释世界，显然是不足的。那从他的这个解释来说呢，他认为要解释地租在古代史上的起源和演化发展的经验过程，首先呢是要从土地所有权说起。所以他举了中东美索不达米亚和埃及、巴比伦等等这些例子。他是指出这些早期的地租呢是劳役或者是交实物，这个一直延续到近代中国农村的地租也是劳役实物相结合的，直到大概30年代前后，当中国的工业化，特别是资本主义工业化有所发展的情况下，才把这个实物租改成货币租。这个对他们来说呢，那他们的这个有货币租的时间呢，大大的早于我们。在地租形式演化之后呢，接着的问题就是地租到底应该是被国家占有，还是应该由一个债权人或者贵族阶级来占有。所以在这个方面呢，他是这个举了很多案例来讨论西方的地租制度。
So in this lecture, and next lecture 5 on finance, I'm going to explain how this deindustrialization of US-style rent and debt deflation should be a warning to China as to what you should avoid to prevent enriching a billionaire class of absentee loaners and their bankers, such as occurred in the United States. Now, obviously, housing prices and rents are going to rise as China grows more prosperous. That's natural. Income becomes more widely distributed, and your cities are going to build more infrastructure, parks, transportation facilities. But housing prices shouldn't be built up on credit, except to reflect the cost value of the buildings. Obviously, property has to cover the cost of building, the physical cost of capital construction, the building, and the improvements. But it shouldn't reflect the land value. The land value is already there. It doesn't have any cost at all because the land is simply there. And that's why the classical economist said this should be the rent base. This is the free lunch. We don't want landlords to get rich, rents going up. We want the homeowners. We want the renters. We want the population to get rich, not the absentee landlords. The way China gets rich is by industrializing its economy, by producing the industrial goods and manufacturers that America is not producing anymore. You don't get rich by imitating the Americans and trying to get rich by land speculation, because that occurs on credit, and all you're left with at the end is a huge amount of debt that can't be repaid. So China's economists, just like classical economists, sought to prevent a rentier class from emerging and doing what Britain's old landed aristocracy did. And the solution was to make land tax the natural tax base, because it's better to tax it for the public than to leave it in the hands of landlords. And for Adam Smith and Ricardo and the others we're going to talk, if you tax this land and monopoly rent, then you don't have to tax wages or profits or income or other kinds of taxes that are proliferating in the United States. Because if you add to your income tax and your sales tax, that's going to increase the cost of living, and that's going to increase the prices that your employers have to pay. If you let housing prices be inflated, then obviously the employers are going to have to pay the workers enough to pay for the higher housing. And all of a sudden, your wages will go up, and you'll be less and less competitive until you price yourself out of the market, just like Americans have priced themselves out of the market. So the virtue of a land tax is that it doesn't it leaves the rental value of good sites available for everybody to get, but people will have to actually earn the money to pay for the housing they get. But housing won't go up beyond what they can pay. You want to keep housing within the ability to pay and to pay about 25% of your income. At least in the United States, 25% was the norm. So how did we get to this situation? I'm going to talk today about how a political struggle was waged for 5,000 years. You can go back to the origins of civilization. There's always been a struggle over who is going to get the value of the land's free rent. And absentee landlords and private creditors have always tried to pry this land rent away from the public authorities. And I think the best way to explain this is to say how land tenure began in the first place. We have the first idea of land tenure, of somebody holding land rights to a particular land in the 4th millennium BC in the Near East, from Mesopotamia and Egypt. You had the agricultural revolution spreading, cities began to be built. How are you going to build up the cities? How are you going to dig the irrigation canals? How are you going to develop sort of a regular economic order? City walls, temples, public buildings, and service in the military. Well, the key to organizing labor was that land was assigned to the community's members. How do you assign it? It's based on their responsibility to perform corvée labor, that is labor for the state, and military duties. So you would have land area valued, okay, such and such a plot of land can feed one family, and it can afford the family to support labor while the whole family's working on building walls, building palaces, building temples, and providing soldiers for the army. So these labor duties were the original tax. You get the land, you have to pay the tax. So the city planners, the rulers, or in Egypt, the pharaohs, began with what were the labor needs, what were the crop needs, what were the tax needs, and then how much land did you have to assign to each family in order to enable them to pay the taxes for these. So it was taxes that created land tenure rights and ultimately land ownership rights. And the owners had a liability to turn over a given amount of crops and work a given number of weeks or months during the year for the city. And that was how public works were built in Mesopotamia. And these were the great socializing process of their day. Workers were fed large amounts of beer. They would have meat at the festivals. We have many pictures on cylinder seals and carved pictures on buildings of workers carrying baskets of earth on their shoulders. It was really hard work to build, to make bricks, to put it up. But at the end of the day, they'd all have a beer party. And maybe once a week they'd have meat, and there wasn't that much meat in early diets that could be afforded. It was like a celebration. This was, it sort of built patriotism. We've all built the city together. But at some point in history, these cultivators were able to commute, that is, and replace their labor obligations with a paying crop. We'll say, okay, we won't work, but we'll give you enough crop to hire somebody to do our work. And ultimately, you could pay money. We'll pay silver for what it would cost to hire labor. The same thing happened in medieval Europe. Europe's economy was monetized after the 13th, 14th century. People who had land could pay for somebody else to do the labor duties that they needed. France, England, pay for somebody else to fight the wars. In America, in the Civil War, you could pay somebody to do the fighting for you. So gradually, you had a monetization of taxes, but labor was the basic measure of all of this. What did it cost the tax? How much labor would the tax cover? And that was true in all early societies, and that survived into the modern world. So personal liberty began to be disrupted when credit came into the picture. All early economies worked on credit, not money. If you were in the 3rd millennium BC during the year and you were a cultivator, it's an agricultural economy, you pay in grain. Well, obviously, if it costs a given amount of grain to buy beer or to buy a priest to officiate at a marriage ceremony or having children, you don't pull grain out of your pocket and pay. The idea was you'd pay grain once a year on the threshing floor. And during the year, if you'd go to an alehouse, the alehouse would mark up a tab, just as on the bars today. If in America and England, you'd go to the bar, they'd have a tab for you. This is how much you owe on payday. Well, payday in ancient Mesopotamia occurred once a year, and that was the harvest time, and all of the tabs that you ran up would be paid, and the taxes that you owed, and the other fees that you owed for the palace and the temples would be paid up at that time. So people would begin to run up debts, but sometimes the crops would fail. Sometimes they couldn't pay. Sometimes a member would get sick and they'd run into debt. And if they'd run into debt, then they'd say, okay, you owe us the debt. The way to pay off a debt in ancient society was to work for the creditor. You'd pay off the debt by working on the creditor's land. And that was true all the way down through Rome and classical antiquity. People would lend money. They didn't want to make money interest. They wanted the labor interest. And then in due course, people would pledge not only the labor, they'd pledge their own landholding, and gradually the lands would begin to pass into the hands of the creditors. So gradually, the idea of making loan was not only to get the labor of the debtor, you'd get the land of the debtor. And sometimes you could do it because so much land rights were by law passed on to your children, especially the oldest child. In Mesopotamia, the creditor would be adopted as the number one son of the debtor. So when the debtor died, the number one son, the creditor from outside the family, would inherit the land. And that was how the big landowners and the big creditors got most of their land. So for 5,000 years, there's been this conflict between creditors and the public sector over who's going to get priority in getting the labor. Because if a debtor owed labor to the creditor, then he couldn't work on the building the walls of the city. He couldn't do the corvette labor, and he couldn't fight in the army. There'd be a military fight, and the creditor would say, I'm sorry, this labor belongs to me. His interest, that's how he's working off the debt. So he's not available to the army. So new rulers, there was a showdown, and new rulers said, okay, we're just going to cancel the debts so that the debtors don't owe any more money. That makes things return to normal, the normal being when they owe their labor to us, they owe the taxes to us, not to the creditors. And every new ruler that took the throne would cancel the debts to start his rule so that everything would begin afresh with people owing the normal taxes, the normal labor services, the normal army services there. And these royal acts reasserted the ruler's power to claim the corvée labor and the military labor. But classical antiquity didn't have kings, and they didn't have this practice of clean slates. There was no clean slates in Greece and Rome, although there were many calls for them, and there were 500 years of revolution when the people wanted debt cancellation and land redistribution, but they didn't get it. There were armed fights. The leaders were often killed, and when kings did arrive in Rome at the very beginning, they were overthrown by the aristocracy that didn't want any kings or any strong government telling them what to do. And that's been true of the creditor class for the last 2,000 years. The creditor class does not want strong government because a strong government can regulate the creditor sector. The strong government can prevent creditors from monopolizing the land and making everybody else into serfs, basically, or debt peons, or having to work it off. So oligarchy of creditors and landowners were the Senate in Rome, and they rewrote the laws to put creditor rights first, not debtor rights. And that's the major characteristic of Western civilization that makes it different.
那我们现在要结合着他的这个分析来谈一点东方的所谓土地权属关系和地租这个归属的这么一个问题。大家也都知道，我刚才说了，普天之下莫非王土，率土之滨莫非王臣。这往往指的是什么呢？指的是这个土地从来就具有公共性，就它不可能是简单的私人占有的土地，也就是说在土地的权属关系上，完整意义的私人占有是不存在的。当然你说这个就普天之下莫非王土，是不是就是国王个人或者皇帝个人来完全占有呢？当然不是，因为皇帝一般的他的治理能力呢，往往是靠郡县制，也就是正规的皇权或者官方治理呢，只达到郡县。那长期以来，特别是魏晋南北朝这次大动乱以后，那中国这个以村落为单位所形成的这个土地的基本权属边界，就是产权边界，大体上就形成了。 因为大家都是要共同劳动，并且呢还要防止各种各样的不安全的因素发生，于是乎聚落而居，形成村社。村社呢，它的土地产权乃至于其他资源产权的边界是以村社的地缘为边界的，所以我们实际上呢就形成了那上层就是这个官方社会呢，它的治理是以郡县的方式来完成的，那它是征税的。那下层呢，则是每一个新的朝代要推行的，首先是均田免赋，把以前的这些债务勾销了，把土地呢再平分一次，让小农在满足自给自足的条件下，有向中央王权交纳税赋的可能。这些呢，其实是历朝历代维持一个长期稳态结构的基本经济关系。那在过了一段时间之后，当然农村中就有的人能力强了，或者有的人呢可能通过某种其他手段能够巧取豪夺了，于是乎呢就出现了，一般来说这个王朝在均田免赋的条件下能稳定个200年左右，但是过了几代人，比如说3、5代人也就是说大概70、80年100把年左右，土地占有的不平均就大量发生了。那各个朝代呢就得中兴，而中兴所采取的措施主要是打击豪强，得再度形成一个稳定的小农平均占有土地这样一个结构。所以一豪强一大族历来是中国这个政治制度的一个非常重要的这么一个内涵吧。所以大家的理解就是他这个西方的教授不了解东方制度，那他所能够比较的呢，其实主要是和西方比较近的这种地方，而这种地方呢，其实并不是真正意义的东方。所以希望大家理解我们并没有想建立任何一个什么东方中心主义的分析体系，但我们只是说呢，西方中心主义的分析体系在不了解东方的历史演变的这样一个局限之中，那他所说的东西方呢，往往指的是非常受到地理空间局限的这个所谓东西方，并不真正意义的了解中国代表的东方。那从这个角度来说，那我们知道这个土地革命，也就是说到20世纪上半叶，我们的3次土地革命所实现的仍然是历朝历代都强调的均田免赋。大家也都知道，我们从1950年完成了这个3次土地革命战争的目标，平均分配土地之后，我们的赋就是这个税赋并没有免，直到2006年我们才彻底免除农业税。也就是说，历朝历代都做的这件事情呢，我们是用了大约有半个多世纪，我们才算完成了一次历朝历代都做的均田免赋。那这样在这样一个基础之上呢，当然就是相对来讲，乡村社会的财产关系趋近于一种平均化，那这个国家的稳定基础就建立了。因为农民是中国人口的最大多数，他们都变成了小土地所有者、小房产所有者，那这个社会当然就相对来讲要稳定的多了。就是在他们有一定的保障的条件下，外出打工劳动力才能忍受得了极低的工资、极差的待遇，中国才能以劳动积累这个快速的进入工业化的高增长。所以这恰恰是跟西方，包括西方所控制的发展中国家最大的不同。所以我说呢，听这第2节的这个课的时候呢，大家要适当的有一点这个讨论，理解呢真正意义的东西方差别，特别是在土地制度和地租的收取，以及和这个有关的政治制度上，到底内涵上有哪些不同。好了，谢谢大家。